everybody. Welcome to the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health webinar. We are so happy to have you join us. My name is Dr. Russell Spieth. I go by Russell. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and Jessica and I are over the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health here at Neomed.
As you know, we have Dr. Kamisha Spates, who will be presenting the topic as a class of our own, supporting the mental health needs of students of color. We're very excited to have her participate. Like I said, I'm going to try and get out of your way really quickly and just have a couple of announcements. We invite you to join us the next webinar on Thursday, November 21st at 12:30 p.m. And we'll have Jessica Stevens from the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board of Wayne Holmes. And she's going to present on preparing our students, faculty, and staff with the QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer model, joined by UA Wayne Campus of College and Worcester QPR trainers. So basically it's about kind of gatekeeper training and how you'd implement that on a campus. And we'll be sending out that registration link soon. So again, thank you all so much for joining.
All right, and thank you, Russell, for getting those important announcements out there. And I also want to thank you all for joining us today. And we have an excellent presenter lined up who I've had the pleasure of serving on a panel with a few years ago, and I've actually followed her work ever since. And so I have the pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Kamisha Spates. Dr. Spates is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Kent State University. She works diligently to unveil stigmas of mental illness and suicide in the Black community. She recently completed a book entitled What Don't Kill Us Makes Us Stronger, where she uncovers reasons for the nearly non-existent rates of suicide with African American women. Her analysis offers a deeper understanding of the positive life strategies that underlie Black women's resilience. Some of her other works also can be found on the Key Issues in Crime and Punishment series, the Sociology Compass Journal, which also examine the role of the Black church in suicide. So really looking at some prevention and postvention as well as mental health awareness. In addition to that, the Northeast Ohio's Black Communities Preparedness to Handle the Rising Suicide Rates, in which we know there's some 2019 data that's recently come out that's really examined that increase and rise in the suicide rates in the African American community, as well as destigmatizing mental illness and trauma among college students. And that's international work that she's doing in Nairobi, Kenya. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kamisha Spates.
To Jessica for that wonderful introduction. Happy to be here today, and I am really excited to share the information that I've come here to talk to you about today. I also want to take a moment to thank the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health for sponsoring and being a part of this wonderful webinar series that you all are offering. So let's jump right into it. As Jessica mentioned, I'm a professor at Kent State University, and so I've been working for some time on the issue of destigmatizing mental illness as well as suicide throughout marginalized communities. And one of the things that I also recently started is the Racial Justice and Health Equity Research and Education Collaborative, where I brought together campus-wide students, graduate and undergraduate students, to study these sorts of topics and hopefully take this information back into the community and ensure that the folks that we are working alongside and the implications for our research get shared outside of just academic spaces. So I just wanted to say that. So I intend to break this discussion today up into about 3 parts. And we'll start with the initial part of just talking about mental illness prevalence rates among college students of color in the United States. And then from there, we will also discuss ways to identify unique stressors faced by students of color, particularly at PWIs, and that's predominantly white institutions. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in just a moment. But again, the unique stressors faced by students of color on these particular campuses. And then I'll conclude by highlighting some factors to consider, both on your own campuses, but also outside of the campus community, which I'll talk about as well in my presentation, and just different ways to support mental health needs of college students of color. And so just to get started, I want to introduce two concepts that you'll hear me mention quite often throughout this conversation, just to ensure that everybody's on the same page. And so the first key concept that I'd like to mention is this whole concept of what a racial minority is. As you can tell from the title and the webinar description, the learning objectives, and so on and so forth, the focus of this particular presentation will be on racial minorities. And so I wanted to kind of briefly discuss what that means in the context of this conversation. And so the U.S. Census Bureau is responsible for racial classification in the United States and have been since 1790. And those racial classifications in the United States have changed multiple times. And so I just want to at least clarify who I'm talking about when I say racial minorities. And so specifically based on the U.S. Census Bureau's classification, I'm specifically talking about Black, American Indians or Alaskan Natives, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders, and Asian Americans. And so you all may be thinking, and some of you may know this already, well, what about Hispanics? Well, the last census, actually I believe the census before the last one, Hispanics was removed as a racial classification, and it is now an ethnic classification. And so white is also a racial classification, but for the context of this discussion, I'll be talking about non-whites and racial minorities, but I'm also talking about, in this case, ethnic minorities, which are Hispanics. And so you could technically classify yourself based on the census as white Hispanic or Black Hispanic, and so on and so forth. But for the purposes of our conversation, we will certainly be talking about Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Asian, and then the Hispanic ethnicity category, which could be white Hispanic. So in addition to that, the other term that I want to clarify up front is PWI. Many of you have heard of that before, and that's essentially a predominantly white institution. So in the United States, the Higher Education Act of 1964 classified particular institutions as minority serving institutions or PWI. And so I should describe that a bit differently. PWIs is not necessarily an official classification, but the definition of a PWI is an institution of higher learning in the United States in which whites account for 50% or greater of the student enrollment. So all other campuses that are not, under this particular numerical category are likely what we would classify as a minority serving institution. Specifically, if we were to break that down even more, we're talking historically Black colleges and universities, we're talking Hispanic serving institutions, and we're also talking about tribal colleges and universities. So for the purposes of this conversation, we will be talking predominantly, almost entirely, about predominantly white institutions. And the reason for that is because there's a great deal of research and literature that talks about kind of some of the mental challenges and some of the complications that students of color experience on predominantly white campuses. So moving forward, this is just kind of a general overview of some statistics that I think are helpful to share. And this is the undergraduate enrollment by race and ethnicity. And this is from the US Department of Education, pretty well-known survey, imagine. And so what we see here is that the majority of growth, if you look both at the 1995 to 96 graph bar here versus the 2015 to 2016, what you see here is that there has been growth, particularly among students of color in the United States as it relates to campuses and universities, or colleges and universities. And so we see this growth that mostly occurred among Hispanic students, followed by Black students, and then we see international and American Indian students. And so overall, students of color make up about 45% of all U.S. college students. And I think that's important to note because when we're talking about students of color on your campuses and in higher education, we need to think about the diversity within these groups. We're not necessarily just talking about Black Americans or Hispanic Americans. We are also talking about increases in both international students as well as students that classify as more than one race, Asian students, and so on and so forth. And so I just wanted to clarify that too. Looks like a piece of my graph is missing, and I can provide that later. But the large blue category is also important to note. So I have a moment of reflection built into my webinar today. Of course, we're not going to stop and allow you all to, reflect over tea or coffee or whatever you typically drink on your with your midday snacks or lunch. But this is just something that I really think is important to go back and reflect on, whether it's today or at a later date, perhaps with other campus community members. But I want you to think about who are the students of color on your campus. I know I just defined this based on what the U.S. Census Bureau says. I know I just showed you a graph or a chart rather that talks about the growth that we've seen specifically among international students and students of color. But I want you to think for just a moment about the racial and ethnic composition of the students on your campus. Have you seen an increase in international students? Has this occurred at your campus? How about Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and so on and so forth? And even thinking the ethnic differences within those racial groups, right? So Jessica mentioned that I've been doing some work in Nairobi, Kenya, and that's been one of the things that I've always had to stay mindful of is what I learned and what I studied specifically about Black Americans in the United States may or may not apply in the context of Kenyan students living in the country of Kenya. So I encourage you to do the same. So moving forward, let's talk a little bit about prevalence rates. And when I say this, I think it's important just to note the fact that prevalence rates in the United States as it relates to mental illness in general, we've seen increases among almost all groups, right? We've seen increases in both diagnoses, we've seen even comorbidity, right? In instances, there's more than one mental illness that exists in a person, more than one. And so the vast majority of college students, as we know, experience transitional stress. We've all been there. We know the difficulty of walking onto a college campus for the very first time, whether we were a college student or whether we were actually working as an employee, faculty, staff, or whatever it may be. And so it takes time, it takes a bit of work to get adjusted to college life. And so we know that, and that is obviously the case for all students. But given that we're talking about students of color, I think it's really important to really start to kind of dissect what the prevalence rates and more importantly, what the lived experiences are of these students on college campuses. And so as you may know, mental health in general is an understudied topic, but especially among college students of color. There's a lot of great organizations doing amazing work, and I'll talk more about that as we progress through the conversation. But mental health among college students of color is an understudied topic. Jessica mentioned that I do work on stigmatizing mental illness, particularly among Black Americans. That is still the case there. And so the understudied notion of this whole idea and what it means in different contexts is important to know. And so when it comes to prevalence rates, unfortunately, a lot of the results are inconclusive. We do see that there are higher rates of depression and anxiety and functional impairment among college students of color in comparison to whites in some studies. But there are other studies that make the argument that there really is no difference in mental illness prevalence rates. And so I think that can be challenging, but some of the clear path to knowledge that we do have, and some of the commonly found themes in the research time and time again, is that being a member of a minority group, being a student of color, In addition to what I just previously discussed, there are increasing rates of suicide among people of color. Again, this is both on the campus community, but this is in the general population. And so in 2017, some of the more recent statistics, national statistics that we have, we've seen increases in suicide among children ages 5 to 11, particularly among African Americans. We've seen increases in suicide rates among teens, Black teen girls, as well as middle-aged Black men. And so we've also seen that we've also seen that campus students of color are least likely or less likely to utilize campus counseling services. So we've seen these potential increases, inconclusive increases in mental illness prevalence rates on college campuses. Then we've also seen increasing suicide rates of people of color in general. And in particular, we've also seen some spikes in college students, white and non-white. But we also see that students of color are less likely to utilize campus counseling services. And so help seeking and utilization rates is a concern for many campus communities. We look at, even when we look within ethnic groups, right, within the Black race, within American Indian, and so on and so forth, we see there's variations even within those particular racial groups. One thing that I thought was interesting is that there was a study conducted that talks about the students of color that actually do use student counseling centers and those sorts of things. And I'm talking specifically, in this case, undergraduate students. And some of the predictors that this particular study found, and it was a pretty expansive survey that was conducted at 66 universities. And one of the things that they found is that greater psychological distress, previous history of psychological distress, and less or lower amounts of family support were predictors of the students of color on these varying campuses that did use the student counseling center. But it's interesting too, because another finding was that the racial and ethnic makeup of the counseling service staff was also a predictor of whether or not students of color utilize those counseling services. So I think that's a powerful finding. And then students of color also report, I mentioned, higher levels of stress than white college students who suffer from depression or anxiety. So although we're not specifically talking about being diagnosed at this point, we are talking about students of color reporting higher levels of stress. So in totality, if we look at everything that the research is showing us, we do see the fact that students of color on predominantly white campuses are more likely to have higher levels of stress. They're more likely to have issues with psychological functioning, but they're less likely to utilize campus counseling services. And so, yet again, another moment of reflection that I think is important for us all to take, and that is, what challenges might students of color on your campus face when seeking help and utilizing campus mental health resources? So I've asked you to reflect already on your racial kind of composition. Who are the students of color on your campuses? But now I'm saying take that a little bit further and think about what challenges might they face. I'll share a personal story. On my work in Nairobi, Kenya, I collected data this past summer on exactly this particular topic. And one of the issues that kept coming up for the students is that there was only one mental health counselor on the entire campus. And so one of the challenges was scheduling, right? Getting in to see this person. And then that person had just, this counselor on the campus that I did my research on and collected the data, this particular person had just received a promotion. And so her role as a campus counselor on campus was just cut into half. So we already know that that's an issue. And so I'm working with them to figure out some ways to begin to unravel some of that. So again, what challenges might students of color on your campus face when seeking help and utilizing campus mental health resources? And keeping in mind that there's an existing stigma about mental illness or suicide within these groups as well. So moving forward, let's talk about stressors among students of color. One of the things that I think is really important to note is that students that attend these particular campuses have a unique experience in comparison to white students. The literature is very clear on this. There are studies dating back several decades on this. As you know, the JED Foundation, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and the Steve Foundation are doing some amazing work with the mental health equity framework. But one of the things that I think everyone has to acknowledge is that the stressors among college students, students of color at colleges and universities in the United States, particularly PWIs, there is a unique experience that these students are having. And I want to take this, as you can imagine, a sociologist, right? I'm going to take this a step further and say we need to think about the lived experiences of students of color in general. Okay, we know that on-campus life, on-campus living is one part of our students' lives. It's one component of what they have to do on a day-to-day basis. But many students, I mentioned me starting the Racial Justice and Health Equity Research and Education Collaborative. I'd say 85 to 90% of my students are students of color or belong to some form of marginalized group. And they talk a lot about their experiences off campus, right? I'm in Kent, I'm at Kent State, Kent, Ohio. So I'm talking about going off into the city and going grocery shopping, or going off into the city and having to run to the post office, or whatever it may be. And then we have to think about the societal experiences. And so college campuses are not in a vacuum. Our students have lived experiences that carry on and off campus. And so I think it's important to stay mindful of kind of how these all sort of intersect. So social stressors, when we think about some of the challenges that our students of color face on predominantly white institution campuses, we're looking at a variety of things, right? And we're looking at prejudice and discrimination. It's not uncommon. Several studies have identified this as a consistent issue that students of color face. More likely to come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. They're more likely to be the first in family to go to college. We also have to think about that in the context of graduate school and getting professional degrees, right? First in the family to go to college. And then they're more likely to have graduated from an underperforming high school. And so a number of these are social structural challenges, right? And kind of race-based stressors. But we also know that these particular, it's really interesting how this all connects. But we also know that these exact same factors that I'm noting here are oftentimes noted in research on mental health and mental illness, particularly of students of color. And so there is a connection between the students that experience prejudice and discrimination. They're more likely to have suicidal ideation. They're more likely to perform below what they would typically perform otherwise in academic settings. And so these are all very important things to note. We can't necessarily just take them and remove them from the overall lives of our students. And so navigating life as a student of color at a PWI, I had to, I was joking with my husband about this because I said I could literally create a PowerPoint that could be 100 slides long with just research and evidence about the challenges of navigating life as a student of color at a PWI. And so I'll just share a few, but I have multiple studies. For those of you that are interested, feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to talk more about this. But there's a culture of stress that we know of. And then, of course, there's, again, I mentioned this a few times, being a member of a minority group at a PWI can increase the psychological functioning of students of color. And a culture of stress is really the stress that occurs as you attempt to kind of make sense of your new, in this case, college environment and assimilate into the culture of what becoming a college student means. Academic inferiority or academic phoniness. This research is kind of aligned with imposter syndrome and things like that. Students of color are more likely to report these feelings than white students on white PWI campuses. The impact of microaggressions on mental health has been confirmed in literature, and that is essentially saying that microaggressions negatively impact not only your psychological health, but they also lower your self-esteem. And so microaggressions, the term itself, are really just those subtle and at times appear to be unconscious, but they negatively impact the psychological health. And so this would kind of fall under racial, this would fall under racial discrimination or prejudice, but it is a slightly different type of event. And so also perceptions of being a burden is something that college students, students of color, have mentioned time and time again, not necessarily feeling as if they belong, of course, with imposter syndrome, but taking it a step further and feeling as if, you know, having to ask questions, having to get perhaps some additional help at times makes them feel as if they are being a burden to those around them, and therefore impacts their psychological health. And then a really interesting concept that's been used quite often on Black males, and that's this whole notion of racial battle fatigue. And this is essentially really just the stress and the fatigue that can go along with having to, or being in environments where environmental stress, and particularly racial and racial prejudice and discrimination, occur over and over again, and then physically and emotionally how that can begin to weigh you down. And so there's that concept has been used a few times with Black male students. And then also AWA, and that's acting white accusation. And so there's research that talks about how these accusations impact psychological functioning, and it also impacts the rates of anxiety or depression. And so these are cases, and particularly on predominantly white campuses, where students of color are being accused of acting white, talking white, dressing white, and so on and so forth. And there's a number of indicators in existing instruments that scholars use to kind of unpack this. But there is a connection between anxiety, depression, and accusations of acting white. And so moving forward, just in terms of supporting the mental health needs of color, I think that for students of color, I think that that's something that that many of us we want to know. We want to ensure that that this is what we're here for, and that the students have what they need. We all know, most of us know that there are issues with retention of students of color, particularly at predominantly white institutions. I mentioned earlier that minority serving institutions is a different type of college university that we have throughout the U.S., historically Black colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, and so on and so forth. But those particular institutions, they have higher retention rates of students of color, and they graduate more students of color oftentimes than predominantly white institutions. And so we need to think about, what does it look like to support our students of color in their mental health at predominantly white institutions? And so yet again, another moment of reflection to think about, share with your campus community, as well as just to reflect on. But what steps has your campus community taken to support the mental health needs of students of color? And once you think about that and come up with what those things are, share them with other people, share them with other campuses. Oftentimes, we're doing these amazing things on our individual campuses, and nobody knows about it. And so I think that once you kind of identify what those steps are, and if we back it up just a bit, going back to the first question of reflection I asked you, who are the students of color on your campus? You may find that your racial composition and ethnic composition looks very different from the campus across town, even within your own city. And so think about how you can support the students on your campus. But again, don't hesitate to share those things with others, and perhaps we can all have those successes together. But in terms of supporting students of color, the next few slides that I have really get at what the literature has to say about kind of creating this campus environment, or this community, or a climate for students of colors to thrive. And one important piece of this puzzle, and sometimes we don't always start here, is to consider a multicultural strength-based approach. Okay, and so if you approach a group, or if you decide to go, to your campus community and institute or implement some of the things that you think students of color on your campus are going to need, start with a strengths-based approach. What kinds of positive things do students of color tap into to further or formulate resilience? What are the kinds of things that, instead of looking at groups as a deficit, or looking at all the things the groups don't have, or the disadvantaged status of some of the students, or the fact that they came from underperforming schools, let's think about some of the strength-based approaches that the students, that you can take and help the students to foster in their own environment. So one that the research is very clear on is ethnic identity. There was a study conducted by McLean and her colleagues that found that ethnic identity is a positive predictor of mental health. And so we're talking in this case about students that, their ethnic identity is what they, it's part of who they are as an individual. They see that, they value that, they appreciate that, they celebrate that, but they also realize that their identity exists within a larger group or larger social context. And so think about ways in which students can celebrate their ethnic identity in a way that serves as more of a protective factor for them. Also, college campuses can be a place of refuge for a lot of students, even PWIs. So this ethnic identity piece, I think, is very important. And then there's an additional study conducted by Hope and colleagues that talks about political activism and how, in certain cases, to a certain extent, this protects and counters, involvement in political activism protects and counters negative stress associated with racial or ethnic discrimination. And so I preface that by saying to a point, because the research also shows that extremely high, although they don't necessarily quantify that, levels of political activism may worsen experiences with discrimination and increase stress, particularly among Black American students. But nonetheless, political activism, moderate levels, appear to counter negative stress associated with racial and ethnic stress-based stress. Spirituality has been affirmed in a number of studies, some among Hispanic Americans, as well as Black men and women. And what they found is that when students are allowed to incorporate their personal beliefs about spirituality into their environment, that tends to kind of buffer some of the psychological distress that can come about from race-based stressors and racial discrimination and those kinds of things. Also, parental and extended family support. This is a big one, particularly for Latinx and Black American students. Having parental support and the support of their extended family, strength-based approach. And again, it's really kind of just incorporating the kinds of cultural norms, values, and beliefs that students of colors hold before they even get to the campus, and making sure that that gets expanded onto the actual campus. And then involvement in student organizations. That's also something that is considered to be a protective factor for the racial and racial discrimination and prejudice and those sorts of things. So keeping those things in mind is important. And so I think what we can take away from this is we need a holistic approach. And so I do have a few literature-based recommendations that are that are important to note. Again, there's a lot of research on this particular topic, but what I tried to do is pull out some specific pieces of the puzzle, kind of some themes that I've seen occur time and time again in research to support the mental health needs of students of color at predominantly white campuses. And so one is consider conducting, if you haven't already done this, a climate study to capture the experiences of each, and I know this is a bit this can be a large task, I get it, but if each marginalized group member, both on campus and off campus. And so what I mean by that is conduct a climate study, get a sense for what the students of color are experiencing on campus. And I expand this to other marginalized group members, right? LGBTQ communities, disability and accessibility services, students that access those sorts of things, first generation college students. But nonetheless, start to dissect and kind of pick apart who the group members are, because one of the things that the research shows is while students of color at PWIs experience very unique challenges that white students don't, those challenges can vary widely even within the group. So if we're looking at gender dynamics among students of color, or if we're looking at sexual orientation and those sorts of things among students of color, then their experiences can even vary from the larger group, so to speak, international students, right? And so looking at ways to pull apart and dissect what the groups are experiencing, both on campus and in their off-campus lives. A mental health needs assessment. This is important because this can aid in determining the reasoning behind help-seeking behaviors or utilization rates. Okay, what are the reasons that students may not be accessing counseling services, or are they accessing counseling services and they're unable to get scheduled onto the books? I personally have had that encounter here on my campus where I have literally walked students to student counseling, and there was a 3-month lag time in terms of them being able to get an appointment. So again, a mental health needs assessment, which is very different than the climate study, because one is looking more at the climate and their experiences on campus and how they navigate them and what their needs are. But this is specifically looking at mental health needs assessment and what's needed in order for the students to feel supported and to counteract many of the challenges that these students are facing at PWI. I would also argue or say that the research is showing that campus administrators should consider, and many are, that's the good thing, is that many campus administrators are considering the societal implications of being a racial and ethnic minority, including these intersecting identities that I've already mentioned. Again, just to help assess intra-group within the race, intra-group differences, and assess the needs. But again, just thinking about the fact that college campuses are not a vacuum. They don't, they're not kind of on Mars off to themselves. Students work in these other environments. Some of them live in these other environments. And so they tend to spend just as much time, if not more time, outside of the campus environment or outside of the college classroom. And so considering the societal implications of being a racial or ethnic minority is something that is incredibly important to this conversation. And then something else that I thought came up quite often in research was just fostering this sense of belonging. Feelings of belonging result in better health outcomes and higher retention rates of students of color. And I think that's kind of common sense. If we feel like we belong somewhere and we're valued and we're not tolerated, then I think that ultimately what that does is it creates this sense of having a sense of being vested in the community and where they are and what, in their day-to-day lives. And so again, the research confirms that. So foster a sense of belonging. And there's a couple of ways to do that. I know you guys are thinking, foster a sense of belonging. How do you do that? Okay, so of course it varies per group, and it's going to vary within various ethnic groups and those kinds of things. But here's a couple of things that came up in the research. Culturally competent staff and faculty members. Ensuring that faculty members and staff and anyone who comes in contact with students are culturally proficient or to an extent competent in dealing with diverse cultures and people from diverse backgrounds. Create a space for where students can feel this sense of belonging. I mentioned starting a research and education collaborative. Part of the mission of that collaborative for me is to create a sense of belonging for students who are interested in studying racial justice, health equity related tasks, interested in equity for all and those sorts of things. And so that's one space that they oftentimes tell me over and over again, I just feel like I have a place here. And so anything that you can do to create that space for students is important. Also, pedagogical approaches in campus programming should be culturally sensitive. Many times, teaching, Center for Teaching and Learning, or whatever have you on your individual campuses can help with this. Our campus is doing some amazing things with this particular effort, and just ensuring that professors in the classroom are mindful of their pedagogical approach, and that they're taking that into the classroom with them. And then establishing a multidimensional system of mentoring and compassion. Okay, so Kent State is doing something that's pretty awesome, and I think is kind of this whole notion of mindfulness and opening up that to the entire community, the campus community, particularly for faculty. But the whole idea is that faculty will then teach this student. But again, this whole notion of compassion and being present in the moment and those sorts of things, but also a multidimensional system of mentorship. That is incredibly important. The research has noted that time and time again, that if students receive mentoring, and not necessarily just from one person, so that's multidimensional, kind of a system of mentoring, and not just the faculty or the staff member of color, but a campus-wide effort, that has a huge impact on how students feel about their environment and the extent to which they feel like they belong. And then lastly, I want to just kind of conclude by talking about the equity and mental health framework from the Steve Fund and the JED Foundation. And so, as you all know, the Steve Fund is the nation's only organization that I'm aware of that focuses on supporting the mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color. And then the JED Foundation is a nonprofit that is seeking to protect the emotional health and prevent suicide for young adults and teens. And so they came together and created the equity and mental health framework. And there are 10 different suggestions that they offer for ways to incorporate and support the mental health of students of color on our campuses. And so you can certainly read through these and consider ways to implement them into your own campus community. But I think that these are also great pieces of knowledge for us to consider, and they have been empirically validated on a number of campuses. So I will end my portion of the presentation here, but I want to thank each of you for your time.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. We've gotten a lot of other feedback in terms of people wanting to present this information to their administration, and that kind of answers another question you all have. Yes, this will be recorded. Yes, it has been recorded, and it will be accessible. And one last time from me, thank you so much, Dr. Spates. That was fantastic. It was very thought-provoking, but also practical. So thank you.
Yeah, the same for me. And thank you all for joining us, for taking the time out of your schedule. So we certainly appreciate your participation.
Thank you all. Have a great day.